I've never lived a democracy here. I just know it from the stories of my family. But I did saw the small, collapse. So I used to go to school and the radio was criticizing Chavez and the television was criticizing Chavez. And then it simply started to fade down until it disappeared. But sometimes I even talk to children here and they know that things were different. So oral tradition and beliefs and values are really strong and survive. So I'm definitely optimistic in Venezuela. Maybe things will stay the same for 20 more years. But once things change, there's going to be a lot of people in a society ready to take things on another direction.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace, conflict, and the media. Our guest today is Tony Frangi-Muad. He's an independent journalist and political analyst based in Caracas, Venezuela. He's written for international news outlets, including Bloomberg, The Economist, and America's Quarterly. He was also editor for the Caracas Chronicles. Tony writes the Substack, Venezuela Weekly, where he keeps a close eye on developments both at home and in the enormous Venezuelan diaspora. Our show's producer, Andrea Muraskin, spoke with Tony about what it's like to work in an authoritarian context, where journalists are often censored and threatened, and sometimes arrested. As you'll hear, it helps to have a sense of humor and a long view of history. This interview was recorded on March 24th. Things may have shifted in Venezuela by the time you hear it.
Tony Frangi-Muad, welcome to Making Peace Visible. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me, Andrea. It's an honor being here.
So I want to start by talking about your Substack, since that's the part of your work that gets updated most frequently. It's called Venezuela Weekly. And the description is unpacking your favorite failed petrostate 1 week at a time from a Caracas-based Zoomer internaut. I can't say that I have a favorite failed petrostate. I was thinking about this. Why should Venezuela be my favorite failed petrostate?
It's clearly the funniest one. It has all the weird stuff, but also the great people, great nature, at the same time, crazy news every week and every month. So it's definitely my favorite one.
What would you say is the general vibe of your newsletter?
So my newsletter, it's a very well summarized and compact weekly retelling of what happened during the week in Venezuela. So it tends to actually be very objective, very journalistic in a way. And it's like a mosaic of all this news to show a bigger story of what happened through the week. And it covers both politics and economics, but also sometimes there's stories on culture and society and on the environment too.
And I should say it's bilingual in English and Spanish.
Yeah, it's bilingual.
Who's your audience, or who do you think of as your audience?
In the Spanish edition, it's mostly Venezuelans. I feel that Venezuela Weekly has managed to create a great niche of readers because on the one hand, we live in a moment where our media ecosystem is really fragmented in Venezuela, and that also means that people are no longer accessing the news as easily as before. The fact that it comes through the email and depends on independent media outlets as the source of the information, it also helps because it, in a way, it outskirts or jumps through censorships. So that's on the Spanish side. But on the English one, there's a lot of Venezuela observers or people abroad who are interested in Venezuela. A lot of people from transnational companies, a lot of people from oil companies, a lot of people from foreign governments, from NGOs, from multilateral bodies like the World Bank, for example.
What do you think is the most rewarding or the best part of your job as a journalist?
Well, I'd say contributing to maintaining a sense of civic values and of democracy in a country that everything seems to be going against that. So just adding my grain of salt to building that sort of antibody system that will still keep and maintain despite the weakness that it has after all this struggle and all these crackdowns.
Is there a particular story or report that you're especially proud of?
More than a story in itself, I've been writing for years on the state of Venezuela museums here. And this has actually generated a lot of scrutiny and accountability on the way things are being done in the museums and the beautiful, massive collections we have here. We have collections that have Matisse, Picasso, Warhol, and they're not in the best condition. So writing that has actually been really gratifying because it puts this topic in the conversation when people maybe are too focused on inflation or on the elections or in the Chevron thing. And then you're like, hey, we also have art and we should care of that art. And seeing people actually share the stories and discuss them and even generate discussions that have led to sort of small, tepid responses from authorities, but responses nevertheless, is really gratifying.
Any journalist who's listening is probably thinking it's hard enough making a living these days as a journalist, even without, censorship and such a small space for media. So do you have other sources of income?
Yeah, I actually do like a lot of stuff besides journalism. I teach as a university professor. I give courses for organizations. For example, right now I'm working with Miss Venezuela, which is like an institution here. It's our NFL. I'm actually teaching the beauty queens on geopolitics and the global context, which is really fun. I do marketing content and social media content for companies. I've done economic and research consultancy with firms here, with NGOs, with private companies. So yeah, I'm doing a lot of things at the same time, but it's fun. It's sometimes exhausting, but it's fun.
So I want to touch on the deportation of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador. It wasn't just Venezuelan migrants, but this was weekend of March 15th. These were people deported under the Alien Enemies Act without due process. Now, the Trump administration said the Venezuelans were part of a gang called Tren de Aragua.
People call it TDA in the United States
Okay,
now. Yeah.
called TDA, yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about that gang? And do you think that these people who were deported were actually gang members?
So El Tren de Aragua literally means the Aragua train. And Aragua is a state in Venezuela which has historically been an industrial center in the country. So Tren de Aragua, in fact, originated within the prison of Tocoron in the state of Aragua. During the late Chavez era, say 2008, 2009, Chavez created a model in which he thought that by giving control of the prisons to the inner leaders within jail, they would try to appease the violence that was happening within the prisons in Venezuela. But the result was that this new form of leadership called pranes emerged, which are like these sort of, feudal warlord that controls the prisons in themselves. And these prisons eventually became like little cities. So in Tocoron, you could find a nightclub, you could find a little petting zoo, and there were even little houses for the relatives of the inmates. So these groups eventually started to behave as gangs and started to operate outside the prison while being controlled from within. So that's how Tren de Aragua appeared. And Tren de Aragua used to kidnap people in Venezuela. It used to work with illicit trades. It used to extort the factories and the businesses nearby. So Tren de Aragua grew a lot. And when Venezuela collapsed after 2014 due to the economic situation, and we started seeing this mass migration of Venezuelans, many Tren de Aragua's members went with the migration and started traffic migrants. They started to participate in the flow of migrants and tried to settle in the places where the Venezuelan diaspora was setting, in Chile, in Peru, in Colombia, and now in the United States. So there also seems to be a lot of exaggeration over the actual power of Tren de Aragua outside of Venezuela and even within Venezuela, because last year the Maduro government actually cracked down on Tocoron prison and took it over again. It's no longer controlled by the gangs. So Tren de Aragua got dispersed, and what it seems to be happening is that now the name has become a sort of umbrella in which different gangs or people participating in illicit trades can self-proclaim themselves as part of Tren de Aragua.
Does that give them like street cred? Is that the idea?
Yeah, it gives them street cred. But in Latin America, migration of Venezuelans have been so big and so fast that they have suffered a lot of xenophobia in countries that have welcomed them, like Chile or Peru particularly. So sometimes Tren de Aragua is an easy scapegoat to blame crime or violence in the country by saying that the Venezuelans actually brought it or are causing them. So recently we saw that the US reported arresting 30 members of Tren de Aragua. And in the end, only one of them actually was apparently related to the group. So in a way, it's becoming like a very wide umbrella in which everything bad that can be applied to a Venezuelan is, blamed on Tren de Aragua. And also it's an easy way to actually scapegoat Venezuelan migrants who have massively entered the US since 2021 and 2022. So, for example, the Trump administration actually said that 137 Venezuelans being sent to El Salvador were part of Tren de Aragua. But it was later known that around 101 of these migrants weren't even deported under the 1798 law, the alien law. So probably most of them didn't even have a relation with crime, as it was later proven. Even the U.S. during the investigations with the court one of the officials said that many of the deported migrants didn't have any criminal history. I don't know if it's the entirety of case, but that at least some cases are random Venezuelan migrants that were identified because they had tattoos, which is something people tend to assign to gangs and are being sent to the very high security prisons of Bukele in El Salvador without due process and under very adverse conditions.
I mean, yeah, there's the end of the humanitarian parole program, which is kind of a fast track to migration for people from a handful of countries, including Venezuela, that Biden put into place. And then the Trump administration announced that's ending on April 24th. So who knows what could happen?
Yeah, this is actually part of a more systemic thing. So a year ago, we saw this horrible murder of an American student, Laken Riley, right? And Trump approved recently, he pushed for the Laken Riley bill, I think that's the name, in Congress in the US, and it got approved with bipartisan support. She was murdered by a Venezuelan illegal migrant. They accused the migrant of being part of Tren de Aragua, and there's no evidence that he actually belonged to the gang. He just acted alone. So, as you see, portraying Venezuelan migrants as violent and as a part of a wider invasion of US territory has actually served a political purpose for Trumpism. When Trump began his second presidency, we also saw that the TPS for more than 350,000 Venezuelans, we're talking the temporary protected status that Biden had granted them, and actually Trump before him, it began with Trump during his last days, was revoked. So that is leaving almost 400,000 Venezuelans in a limbo. And now he's also revoking the Biden-era humanitarian parole on another group of Venezuelans that actually came with the parole. They were not in the States before being accepted into the program, unlike the TPS Venezuelans. So if you take the more than 100,000 Venezuelans that are now losing the parole, plus the 350,000 that lost the TPS, we're creating a group of around 450,000 Venezuelans entering a sort of legal limbo in the States.
I do want to talk about politics inside Venezuela. So, as you reported, there was some real momentum behind the opposition in the lead up to the presidential election last July. There were rallies for the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia, and he actually won, but the government didn't acknowledge the win, and Maduro is still president. What has changed in the country now that it's clear that Maduro doesn't have the support of most Venezuelans?
So the collapse of the government's popularity has been actually happening for years, but the July 28th elections were a sort of breakdown of any remaining legitimacy the government still had, because the opposition managed to prove that the official results were not the same that the polling station machines were showing. So the opposition did a great game in doing that, but after that, they haven't managed to actually push for a democratic transition. Many people had expectations that on January 10, Edmundo Gonzalez would come back because he was exiled to Spain, while the actual opposition leader, who is Maria Corina Machado, Edmundo was her proxy candidate because she was banned from running by the Supreme Court. She remains hiding, like most of the opposition leadership, who are either hiding, in exile, or in jail at this point. So when Edmundo didn't return on January 10 and Maduro was sworn in for a new presidential term, I think that many Venezuelans enter a sort of grief or a period of delusionment that change was possible, as they had believed the previous year when Maria Corina actually managed to repoliticize the country and bring back the idea of hope to the conversation. So now we're seeing a sort of more restrictive environment. So we're seeing a closure of media in Venezuela more than usual because funding has become really difficult and the system in itself has become more restrictive. We saw the creation of an anti-NGO law, and then we saw a massive crackdown on the opposition. So opposition parties and groups are, in a way, flattened. We went from having 200 political prisoners by the beginning of 2024 to a peak of almost 2,000 by the end of last year. Now there's around 900, according to Foro Penal, which is a watchdog here in Venezuela. The economy became really stagnated after the elections, and probably gonna get worse now with the Chevron license revocation.
And we should say people might not be aware that the Venezuelan economy has had a little bit of recovery since the worst of the crisis, right, in the last few years.
Yeah, it has a sort of small recovery since 2021, more or less. We saw that the government eliminated price controls, eliminated currency exchange controls, and they also allowed the dollar to circulate freely. So what we saw was that imports surged a lot in Venezuela. Now you can find any product you can imagine here. There's no longer shortages. Inflation is still very high, but it's no longer hyperinflation. And we saw the recovery of certain sectors of the economy, goods and services, of marketing, of communications, of professional services, of food, of health. Other sectors, like parts of agro-industry, parts of the oil sector, well, most of the oil sector, they haven't come back. And it's still a very small recovery. It's definitely not the horror we used to see in 2017, although nevertheless, Venezuela still has a humanitarian crisis. It's a very unequal country.
When we spoke earlier, you were telling me that while the situation for media has been pretty suppressed for a long time, Venezuela has a history of having a vibrant independent media. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So Venezuela, unlike many modern autocracies, comes from a democracy. Venezuela managed to have at least 40 years of democratic governments. So during that period, we developed a very rich media ecosystem. We had big television channels, just like the US had ABC and CBS and NBC. Well, we had Venevisión and RCTV, but also Televen and Globovisión. We had major newspapers, just like the US had Wall Street Journal, New York Times. We had El Nacional, we had El Universal. And then we had another array of smaller newspapers. We had vibrant magazines that were very much our sort of, The Atlantic or Vanity Fair, like Revista Acceso back then. We had a lot, and we still have a lot of radio stations that were very big. And of course, around all these news sites and news outlets, and there were also marketing agencies, there were also concerts. It was a very, very vibrant media ecosystem. So it was probably one of the freest ones in Latin America for a long time, if not the freest one during the 80s, 90s. But that has changed a lot in the last 25 years. So that's something that differentiates the rise of Chavismo with other authoritarian movements. It had to face a very well-developed media ecosystem with a whole class of journalists and people who worked on communications when it began to establish the revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution. So that was more or less the context when they took over, when they won the presidency in 1999. It was a Venezuela in which you waked up in the morning, you had big television channels openly discussing the news, openly criticizing the government. Same with the newspapers that you can find on kiosks throughout every city. The radio stations were doing the same. You had like these superstar journalists that were really well known back then, especially during the period of high polarization in the early 2000s. In fact, Venezuela was probably one of the first countries in Latin America to launch its own internet outlets for young people in the late 90s. But that has all changed a lot since then.
So you have Chavez coming to power in 1999 and starting to consolidate power, and then some years later, you had the beginning of the economic collapse. How did the economic collapse and the crackdown on journalists kind of go together? What was the effect on press freedom?
So the crackdown on journalism actually began a lot of years before the economic collapse. So when Chavez took over, he did massive institutional changes. He rewrote the constitution. He changed the name of the country. The Supreme Court was replaced by the Supreme Tribunal of Justice. The Congress was replaced by the National Assembly, and so on. So Chavez started this process of massive consolidation of institutions. He was a very charismatic populist leader, but he was also very distrusted and hated by his opponents. So Venezuela became really polarized. And when Chavez started doing these institutional takeovers, when his populist rhetoric became violent, when the economy started to see a higher and higher and higher government intervention, of course, the media became really critical. And in 2002, the country entered into an spiral of conflict in which Chavez was actually ousted for 3 days from power. And then he came back. So part of this movement was really pushed by the mass media in Venezuela. The newspapers and the television channels were openly against him. And Chavez decided that the only way that he could keep power was by, I'm going to say this symbolically, but by breaking the necks of those that had led this movement. That included not only the media, but also the national oil company and the business sector and the unions. So the oil company, he took it over, even though it was already public, and he fired 18,000 employees, and he put a bunch of loyalists inside. So the business sector, Chavez started to expropriate factories and companies and assets. But with the media, at first, Chavismo went with lawfare, right? So at first, they sued journalists for defamation, supposedly, or media outlets for promoting violence. Sometimes these were like really trumped up charges. There were even cases of judicial rulings in which they would tell outlets that they couldn't report on a specific themes, usually corruption. Like, you cannot talk about this official. And they were barred by law. So many journalists started to leave the country and report from Miami or from Colombia. But then in 2007, Chavez closed down the oldest television channel in the country, Radio Caracas Televisión, RCTV. Probably the most widely seen television channel in Venezuela was closed down. And it hasn't come back ever since. They actually tried to continue on satellite services like DirecTV, but then Venezuela also barred them from getting access to these private services. So that was the first major crackdown on the media. It created a sort of fear effect on other television channels. But one of them, Globovisión, became actually more and more and more critic. It became like Fox News for the Republicans or CNN, MSNBC for the Democrats. And it was very, sided with one group. It was a very opposition channel. And what they did was that they harassed the channel. They sometimes nationalized that, like part of their infrastructure, stuff like that, until one day the harassment was so strong that the owners decided to sell Globovisión. And they sold it to businessmen that were close to the government. And now Globovisión is actually a Chavista channel. So it completely changed from what it used to be. So that's what they started to do with the newspapers. Instead of closing them down, they started to buy them. El Universal, which was like the most respected, the biggest newspaper, they bought it with people close to them. They deleted the online archives, and it became a propaganda newspaper. Meanwhile, El Nacional, which was like the counterpart of El Universal, what they did was they monopolized paper. Paper could only be handled by a state-owned company, and they decided to choose who could get paper and who couldn't. So eventually, El Nacional could no longer get any paper, and that happened with a lot of regional newspapers in Venezuela, and they had to become completely online. So by the time that the country collapsed because of all these crazy, erratic economic policies, our media ecosystem was mostly shut down on the mass media. Even radio stations watered down their tones. Sometimes there's protests in the streets, and you put the radio, and it's like music or whatever random topic, not what's actually happening outside. So many of these journalists who were from the old television channels, from the old newspapers that took over or were forced out of circulation, moved to new outlets created online. And in Venezuela, since 2013, 14, 15, has actually had a very rich online ecosystem of media outlets. But the government simply started to block them. So you need VPN to access many of them. Or now it blocked Twitter, which was also their main channel of communication, and funding became scarce because the private sector was afraid of giving money to these outlets because they could get retaliation. So many of these outlets actually started to depend on foreign cooperation or on donations. And of course, with the cuts that are happening in the world right now, and with the general impoverishment of Venezuela and the Venezuelan people, it has become a financial hell for many of these outlets, and some of them are actually either reducing their staff a lot or just simply going out of operation.
With the cuts, are you referring to the cuts to USAID?
Mostly USAID, yes, but also in the last year, part of the cooperation that Venezuela and civil society was receiving has really become smaller because Venezuela attracted a lot of international interest back in 2019 or 17. But ever since the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, part of that cooperation has moved to other hotspots of conflict, and Venezuela has become a sort of, lost case.
Not hot enough.
Yeah, it's a slow, agonizing death of 25 years.
So tell me a bit about the censorship and repression that journalists in Venezuela face.
Yeah, so in Venezuela, it's not common to have journalists jailed. It has happened mostly in the last year. It wasn't that common before. And in fact, all the journalists that were jailed last year were released by the end of the year. So the government doesn't seem to be very hardliner on its repression with journalists. It's rather more soft, sophisticated repression. So instead of putting people in jail, you maybe threaten them. So you generate this shockwave of fear, and you create what we call autocensura, like self-censorship, which is becoming increasingly common in Venezuela. You think, like, should I tweet this? Should I say this? Should I report this? What words should I use when describing this? Then on the other hand, besides the intimidation, beside the specific arrests that sometimes happen, what we're seeing now is a lot of internet blockades, right? So you need a VPN to access most independent outlets in Venezuela. Not all of them, and sometimes it even varies by the server you're using, but many of them are just blocked. And then it has expanded recently to not only the sites, but the social media where these sites are operating. So now we have Twitter blocked here ever since Elon Musk publicly clashed with Maduro, and people were using Twitter to communicate a lot during the elections. Sometimes TikTok is temporarily blocked in Venezuela, and we see this a lot with other apps and stuff happening all the time. And then, of course, the shockwave and the financial asphyxiation has led to massive resignations, or people who are just saying, like, I no longer want to work in journalism. So it's a multi-front attack on the media, but it's very sophisticated. And then you have these arbitrary laws. For example, a few years ago, the government approved the anti-hate law, which is a law that prosecutes anyone promoting hate. But who defines what hate is, right? We've seen Chavista officials calling literally for the murder of Maria Corina Machado or burning her image, and nothing happens. But then we see people burning images of Maduro or stuff like that and getting in jail. And sometimes it's even used for random stuff. Like recently, this TikToker posted a TikTok saying that she was happy that the mother of someone she hates died of cancer or something like that, and they put her under the hate law and got arrested. So it's extremely arbitrary the way these laws are used.
There's a lot of laughing at all this absurdity that goes on in Venezuela, or like laughing so you don't cry.
Yeah, that's the Venezuelan way of life. We're a Caribbean country, and people always say, like, why are Venezuelans laughing so much at this? This is serious, but like, what else can we do? It's our way of being. We have an amazing outlet. It actually has gotten itself in problems with the government. It's called Chihuire Bipolar. It means the bipolar capybara. It's like the Onion here. And their satire is so fun because sometimes what they're making fun actually ends up happening in Venezuela. For example, now they're making a lot of jokes about deportations from Trump. So it's stuff like Donald Trump shows the Venezuelan he hunted himself in the Oval Office. Then it's like a Venezuelan in a cage and Trump sitting next to him, stuff like that. And then they make fun of like the Magazuelans in Florida. So like girl celebrates that her dad gets deported because Trump told her he's a member of Tren de Aragua. Stuff like that. You should check it out.
Yeah, send me a link and I'll put it in the show notes. So how do you make these calculations for your own safety, and like how do you know when you can be a little bit more free, and then when do you sort of self-censor?
Okay, so you start seeing around how are the other journalists and outlets operating? And there's always people saying more sensitive stuff than you. And then you are like, well, maybe it's not as dangerous because they're doing this. So that's on the one hand. But then there's topics that you don't touch. Like, for example, I don't like to go into corruption because I know it might be really dangerous for me being here in Venezuela. There's journalists covering that, but they live abroad. And they live abroad for a reason. I feel we all end up doing self-censorship when we talk and when we write. We end up using vague terms. Or, for example, in Venezuela, you won't see any local outlet called Edmundo González the president. They know that if you call him the president, you're defying Maduro as the president. And that would be trouble. That would be a lot of trouble. So it also has to do with how you manage your language in Venezuela.
As you said, the state media has a lot of power in Venezuela. They bought a lot of the news outlets that used to be independent. Other news outlets have gone out of business. But we also discussed that the government has very little support actually among the people. So do you think Venezuelans believe state media, or do you think most people like see through it?
I don't think that Venezuelans believe in state media at all. But I do think that there's other sneakier ways in which you can get the information to the Venezuelans. And that's where the danger is. Chavismo actually uses a lot of bots and trolls to flood social media. And there's a lot of disinformation. The opposition use them too sometimes. There are no saints either with the management of communication, but never, ever to the levels of Chavismo. Because Chavismo has all the state resources and institutions on its side. So they managed to actually get narratives and stories to get viral in social media and to affect people. So maybe if you see them in the state channel, you don't believe it. But then you see this random account called Noticia Venezuela, like Venezuela News. Many of these outlets actually pretend to be radical opposition people. So they're called like Resistance Venezuela and stuff like that. And they end up promoting narratives that are critical of the opposition mainstream leadership. coming from like a pure opposition. Like, oh, the opposition is doing negotiations. They're going behind your back and they will betray what you wanted.
It's really psychological warfare.
Yeah, it really is. And it generates distrust in the opposition and then distrust in the system itself, because Chavismo doesn't want people to, for example, to vote or to participate in whatever spaces are left in our facade of liberal institutionalism. So people, I don't think they believe the state media, but the state media anyway can continue bombing informationally. And then also the opposition media sometimes tend to do that, but on a lesser scale. So Venezuelan media outlets really have a tough time competing with this flood of disinformation, which is also fed by the rise of new actors. You see a lot of weird YouTubers giving their radical opinions and stuff. You see I've seen, for example, people in Venezuela, like evangelical people, listening to pastors who give the news. That's really strange to me, because you end up realizing that the ecosystem is really fragmented and that people are getting their news from alternative sources that you don't tend to think. Because, of course, I come from Caracas, I come from the capital. I'm a college-educated Venezuelan in this bubble of middle to upper-class Venezuelans who had college degrees and who have been of the opposition since day one and who have traveled abroad, and some of them studied abroad, and all of them have a sort of media literacy, and you think that's what the whole country reads. But then you go outside that thin sector of the population and you find out that people are getting their news from all these different sources, all this varied, strange ecosystem. And then if you go deep into the countryside, sometimes the only source is the state media. So, it's like a postmodern nightmare in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's happening all over the world to some extent. I heard somebody say, I think it was about Russian propaganda in Ukraine, that the point is not to make you believe that the propaganda is true. The point is to convince you that there is no truth.
Anne Applebaum was saying that.
Yeah. I listened to her book talk. That's right.
And she was saying that they do it like to the point of, it's not really like the truth doesn't exist, but also the fact that they want to tell you we can lie to you and we don't care.
Yeah. So in a way, it's like if you trust that priest, then getting your news from the priest kind of makes sense, because who else can you trust?
Yeah, definitely. And the media ecosystem here is so strange. For example, when you travel in Conviasa, that's the national airliner, you get the Conviasa magazine, like a random airplane magazine. But on the cover, you have a picture of Maduro, of the president. And when you open it up, there's a comic. So in the last 2 years, Maduro has pushed for this character called Super Bigote, literally like super mustache. And it's himself. It's himself as a superhero. And then he has like a female sidekick called Silita, which is like Celia Flores, the first lady. And they fight enemies and stuff. So when you get to the plane, the comic shows Super Bigote fighting with La Sayona. La Sayona is a ghost in Venezuelan folklore, like a female ghost. But the face is Maria Corina Machado. So he's fighting Maria Corina Machado as an evil, satanic ghost. And she's supported by this legion of Satanists that include like Elon Musk and Venezuelan influencers and YouTubers that supported Machado after July 28 elections. And like Super Bigote, like Super Mustache, is defending Venezuelan children from all these threats from the opposition, the fascist opposition, and the United States empire. So it's really crazy. You should look it up.
That sounds crazy. So do you have any optimism when it comes to Venezuela?
I'm always optimistic with Venezuela because after 40 years of democracy, it has created a sort of antibodies in our society that keeps people in Venezuela working and striving for a better country. I'm amazed by the amount of people still doing research here, still believing that things should be different, must be different. I'm amazed by the amount of startups, of tech enterprises that have appeared in the last years in Caracas, of the amount of people still trying to invest and work in adverse conditions because they believe that a better country is possible. And 40 years of democracy with massive university education cannot simply go to the toilet. So it has generated a lot of really ambitious, really admirable people working for the country from within and also abroad.
You're a Gen Z, right? You're a Zoomer.
Yeah.
So you don't even really remember like the quote unquote good times, right?
I've never lived a democracy here.
Yeah.
I just know it from the stories of my family. But I did saw the small, collapse. So I used to go to school and the radio was criticizing Chavez and the television was criticizing Chavez. And then it simply started to fade down until it disappeared. But sometimes I even talk to children here and they know that things were different. So oral tradition and beliefs and values are really strong and survive. So I'm definitely optimistic in Venezuela. Maybe things will stay the same for 20 more years. But once things change, there's going to be a lot of people in a society ready to take things on another direction.
And to embrace democracy again?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure of that. Authoritarianism is not really ingrained in our way of doing things. And we also have a lot of potential. Like I was saying, yes, we have a massive, really well-educated professional class, but we also have a lot of infrastructure from the rich times. We have a lot of resources, not only the traditional ones like oil and gas and gold, but things that could be used for energy transitions, like minerals, like we could do blue and green hydrogen. We could even use the empty oil wells for carbon removal processes. So things are definitely not good, but Venezuela is definitely not a lost case.
Well, thank you for taking this time to speak with me.
No, thank you. I'm really thankful for the invitation. Hope it doesn't get me into trouble.
You can find Tony Frangi Mawad on his Substack, Venezuela Weekly, and at tonyfrangi.com. We have links in the show notes. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrea Muraskin. The associate producer is Faith McClure, and I'm Jamil Simon. You can now find us on Blue Sky. We're at makingpeacevisible.bsky.social, or just search Making Peace Visible. If you have an idea for a topic or guest, get in touch at info@makingpeacevisible.org. Thanks for listening, and talk soon.